Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to China's SAF Export Opportunity, Building Supply Chains for Global Demand. My name's Roz. I'm the Content Director for the SAF China Congress. Sustainable Aviation Futures hosts a global series of high-level SAF and aviation decarbonisation conferences, bringing together the entire value chain to network, connect, and discuss the capabilities for scaling innovative energy solutions and powering a thriving aviation industry. Over the next 60 minutes, our panel of experts will explore how China can position itself as a key producer and exporter within the global SAF market, the role of certification and market access, what global buyers are looking for in SAF suppliers, and feedstocks, logistics, and infrastructure considerations. The webinar is being hosted ahead of the inaugural Sustainable Aviation Futures China Congress, a brand new event in our portfolio taking place in Hong Kong on September 21st and 22nd. Today, we'll provide a snapshot into some of the topics covered at the event, which will also include all of our speakers today. The two-day event will see 250 senior leaders and industry experts from across the entire aviation and energy value chain, both within the region and from the international SAF sector too. So we're delighted to be supported by the global SAF industry. The event will discuss policy and demand signals, designing a blend mandate, how credits could work, which fuels qualify, and what we can learn from global policy, building the next generation of clean hydrogen, carbon capture, and e-fuels, and turning China into a global trading hub with aligned standards and certification, contracting models, and buyer requirements that move fuel internationally. All attendees for this webinar will benefit from a 10% discount to attend, so please reach out to one of the team on screen now to join us in September. And remember, prices will increase after next Friday. If you'd like to keep abreast of all of our upcoming events, as well as gain access to exclusive interviews and articles, be sure to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, SAF Spotlight, which you can find at www.sustainableaviationfutures.com. Finally, before I hand over to today's moderator, a couple of bits of housekeeping. The session is being recorded and will be distributed to you once the webinar finishes, so if you have to leave for any reason, you won't miss out, although you might miss Q&A opportunities, which brings us to my next point. There is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, so please ask any questions you have there rather than in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to them. With that, I'm pleased to hand over to our moderator, Dr. Raji Olaganathan from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Sorry, Raji, over to you.
Thank you, Roz. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome. Whether you are joining us from China, elsewhere in Asia, Pacific region, Europe, or Americas, or anywhere else around the world, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And it's a real pleasure to serve as a moderator for today's webinar. And we are actually meeting at an important moment for our industry. Across the world, aviation is working towards the shared goal of achieving net zero carbon emission by 2050, and SAF has moved from being viewed as a promising alternative fuel to becoming one of the aviation sector's most important decarbonization solution. But producing more SAF is only part of the story, and the bigger challenge, and perhaps the more interesting one, is how we build an industry that can deliver SAF at a scale aviation will ultimately require. That means that connecting every part of the value chain. It means bringing together the feedstock, production capacity, certification, logistics, financing, digital traceability, and international markets, everything into one integrated and trusted ecosystem. And every link in this chain matters because confidence is just as important as production. And airlines needs the confidence, and investors need confidence, and regulators needs confidence, and ultimately passengers do as well. So where does China fit into all of this? China has many ingredients needed to become a major contributor to the global SAF market. And it also has a strong industrial base, expanding the renewable energy capabilities. And it also has a rapidly advancing technological ecosystem, and this growing experience across multiple SAF pathways. And the international demand for SAF is also growing, and China has a huge opportunity not only to meet the domestic aviation needs, but also to become an increasingly important supplier to the global market. But realizing that opportunity will require more than the production capacity alone. And success actually depends on internationally recognized certification, credible carbon accounting, trusted sustainability standards, efficient supply chain, and strong international partnerships. In other words, it depends on building the confidence that allows the producers, airlines, investors, and governments to work together across the geographical borders. And that's exactly the conversation we had like to have today. And together we will explore how China can strengthen its position within the global SAF value chain, what international buyers are looking for from SAF suppliers, and we will also look into how technology partnerships, digital innovation, as well as the market mechanisms can accelerate the investment in the China and commercialization of the SAF products produced there, and how the feedstocks, logistics, certification, and policy must come together to build a resilient and scalable supply chains for both domestic as well as international aviation. And to help us explore these issues, we are joined by an outstanding panel whose expertise spans around the entire SAF ecosystem, from government policy to industrial development to commercial markets and digital innovation. So each of our panelists brings a different perspective, and that's what makes today's discussion particularly more valuable. And there is no single solution to scale SAF. It takes a collaboration across the entire value chain. And today's panel reflects exactly that. And my hope is that by the end of this discussion, you will leave with a better understanding, not only about how China's growing role in the global SAF market, but also of the partnerships, the market mechanisms, and the technologies, and how the policy frameworks are shaping the SAF market. And ultimately, it will help you to determine how quickly SAF can scale at the global level. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelist. Our first panelist is Mr. Yizhen Chen, Chief Operating Officer of the SAF Center under the Second Research Institute of Civil Aviation Administration of China. And Yizhen plays a leading role in advancing China's SAF ecosystem, from policy development and industry standards to supporting the technologies that will drive China's long-term aviation decarbonization strategy. And having worked across both government and industry, he brings a valuable perspective on how China's domestic ambitions connect with international SAF markets. Yizhen, we are delighted to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Rajiv.
And our next panelist is Mr. Patrick Edmond, Chief Marketing Officer of Future Energy Global. And Patrick has spent more than 3 decades working across aviation, technology, and sustainability. And today he is actually collaborating with airlines, SAF producers, investors, and corporate customers to accelerate the commercial deployment of SAF. And his experience gives him a unique understanding of what international buyers are looking for as SAF markets continue to mature. Patrick, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Raji. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And our third panelist is Mr. Arnaud Brawley, founder and chief executive officer of Easy Impact. Arnaud is internationally recognized for his work at the intersection of aviation, sustainability, and digital innovation. Through Easy Impact, he's actually helping to develop digital solution that improves transparency, traceability, and trust across the global SAF markets. Arnaud, it's wonderful to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks a lot, Raji. Glad to be here, and hi, everyone.
So thank you once again for all our panelists for joining us today. As you just heard, today's panel brings together the expertise from across all the SAF ecosystems, spanning from government and industry development, commercial markets, digital innovation as well. So what's particularly exciting is that these are not separate conversations. These are part of the same story. And the future of SAF won't be determined by the production alone. It will be shaped by how effectively we are able to connect the policy, technology, investment, certification, and market demand. So before we begin, I just want to encourage the panelists to treat this as a conversation rather than a series of individual question and answers. And please feel free to build on one another's perspectives and response to points that resonate with you, and or if you want to offer an alternative viewpoint wherever it was appropriate. With that, let's begin. So every successful industry transformation begins with understanding where we are today. And China has made remarkable progress in SAF over the recent years. But as a global demand accelerates, the question is no longer whether China can produce SAF, it's how China can position itself within the increasingly interconnected global market. So, Ethan, I had like to begin with you. Perhaps we could begin with a broader picture. China has made significant progress in advancing SAF over recent years. From your perspective, how would you describe the current state of China's SAF industry, and what do you see as the most important milestones that have helped to position China within the global aviation decarbonization landscape?
Yeah, thank you, Raji. And regarding China, so first of all, I would say that the whole country actually is in the transition period to to grow in a more kind of green and sustainable way. So as a developing country, I think we are really working hard for the kind of low carbon transition, and the governments had about the 2030 is the carbon peak and 2060 is a carbon neutral. And in that perspective, that aviation is part of the industry that the Chinese, the governments, and also all the stakeholders in various industries are working on. And I think in the past, let's look at in retrospect from a policy wide, the sustainable aviation field definitely is including one of the, in China, we always put those very important things into a 5-year cycle planning. Well, definitely, SAF was included in the 14th 5-year plan and also will continue to just take the priority in the new kind of a 5-year cycle in the 15th 5-year plan. This is from the national policy level. And if you look at the capacity, I mean, the production that the Chinese, definitely the manufacturers are working steadily to catching up with and even I think currently we have about 1.5 million tons per year as the sub capacity, which is definitely leading in the Asia Pacific region. And I think that we're still keeping a very good momentum on that. And looking ahead, I think the most impressive things we had is, I would say, is the pilot program launched in 2024. Initially, we selected 4 international airports in China with only very selected airlines to try to use that SAF. But gradually, actually, the pilots has been extended to all the domestic flights, and with currently, the latest is that over 10 airports has been upgraded with the infrastructure in terms of the sub-landing facility, as well as the into-plane services. So all in all, I think SAF is still kind of a new business in China, but this is fully aligned with the national transition, as well as all the Chinese people are happy with, we all like the cleaner skies. We are facing the same challenge on a kind of a climate. So I think this is exactly the way all the Chinese people are working on. And although it's a relatively new, but we are keeping on the record, keeping on the track, and with a very good momentum. This is what I want to say about the whole picture in China. Rajiv.
That's a fascinating overview, Ethan. Thank you. And if you had to identify one development over the last 5 years that has had the greatest impact on China's SAF progress, what would it be?
Rajiv, again, please, are you asking about, say it again,
Yeah.
please?
Yeah, if you had to identify one development over the last 5 years which has helped China's SAF progress, what would it be?
You mean from the Chinese government's perspective?
Yeah, government's perspective.
Well, I think, yeah, the key is that, as I said, the Chinese government's always put those key or important things about the 5 years plan. Well, I think that was very fortunate that SAF was included in the last cycle and will continue, in the kind of a new 5 year cycle. This is a very strong signal for all the stakeholders to work on that industry.
Thank you, Isan. You have actually helped to set the scene by outlining China's current SAF landscape. And of course, production is only the part of the equation. And Patrick, actually,
Yeah.
I'd like to bring you into the conversation from the market perspective. So most of today's conversation around SAF is understandably focused on regulatory mandates and compliance obligations. However, the voluntary SAF market is rapidly gaining momentum and creating new commercial opportunities. So, from your perspective, how do you see the voluntary and compliance markets complementing each other, and what does that mean for emerging producers, especially in China, that are looking to participate in the global SAF market?
That's a really important question, Raji, and I'm delighted to have a chance to discuss that and the wider questions this morning here. We talk a lot, of course, about the mandated market. We know about, excuse me, global SAF mandates such as Refuel EU Aviation in the European Union, the United Kingdom SAF mandate, the newer mandates such as that in Singapore and other countries that are talking about a mandate where the government is imposing a certain amount of SAF within the jet fuel blend. However, in parallel to those mandated markets, there's also the voluntary SAF market. And by that, I mean airlines who are choosing to buy extra SAF. They are setting targets for themselves. For example, they may say 10% of the fuel we use by 2030 will be SAF. And nobody's forcing them to do that. They want to do that, and they're choosing to do that. That voluntary market is also supported by companies who want to compensate for their travel emissions, and they're buying credits within that voluntary market. So that voluntary market is additional to the mandated market. And the reason I mention it is because it doesn't have to rely on the same regulations as the mandated market. So airlines, for example, who are voluntarily buying SAF can choose to buy SAF in different places in the world. They can choose to buy SAF at the airports they fly to, or, and I think we'll talk some more about this, they can use a system known as book and claim, where they buy the attributes, the emission savings of the SAF separately from the actual molecules. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about book and claim. It's a system that is already very commonly used in other renewable energy markets, and we're seeing more and more use of that in the context of SAF, because a SAF producer is actually producing two things at the same time. They're producing molecules, hydrocarbon molecules that make a plane's engine work, and they are producing emissions savings compared to fossil fuel. And those two things both have a value in the market, but maybe in different places in the market. So by using book and claim, a producer, for example, in China can make fuel, can bring it to a local airport in China, but at the same time can sell those emission savings as a paper transaction anywhere in the world in the voluntary market. So it's a way of enabling efficient and lower cost producers to gain access to a global market.
Thank you, Patrick. You have actually highlighted some of the key market dynamics that shapes the future of SAF. And that naturally raises a broader strategic question. If China is to participate successfully in this evolving market, where does it fit within the global SAF value chain? And what strength does China bring in?
That's a super question. I think China has enormous strengths in this area. The number of SAF producers in China obviously is growing steadily. China has the benefit of very good feedstock, access to renewable energy, good infrastructure, and those producers are able to sell not just locally and regionally, but as I've mentioned, they're also able to sell globally, and they're able, I think, to compete very effectively in a growing voluntary market compared to other producers, perhaps in higher cost locations in the world. And the condition or the requirement for any producer trying to sell into that global market is, of course, very robust certification environment. So all of the SAF producers that we talk to across the world are working on getting their production and their facilities certified to globally recognized standards. That might be, for example, ISCC Corsia, ISCC Plus, one of the RSB standards. So that is what will I say? That is the guarantee for a global market of the correct level of sustainability for the product. And I think that's going to be essential for Chinese producers who want to sell into a global market.
Thank you, Patrick. Arnaud, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now. So China has the industrial capability, technical expertise, and growing capacity to produce the SAF for the international markets. From your perspective, where do you see China fitting within the evolving global SAF value chain? And what unique strengths could it enable it to become a trusted international supplier?
Thank you, Reggie, for the question. And I will not repeat what Patrick has already touched, but for sure, China can become a very large-scale production hub. They have all the ingredients needed to be a major SAF supplier, overall, the industrial scale, the refining and engineering capability, competitive manufacturing, the people as well, but mostly as well the ability to deploy infrastructure quickly. So that's key. Second aspect, which can see the potential access to significant feedstock, whether we talk about used cooking oil, waste, residues, but as well, and soon, competitive renewable energy base, talking about green hydrogen, of course. So that's definitely something that China is absolutely very strong. One of the things which I would more specifically point out for China is a Greater Bay Area ecosystem, including Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, and under the control of ESON, of course. But the specific configuration can, imply the mainland China. We can provide those production capacity, technology, feedstock, and so on. With Hong Kong, we can contribute international finance, commodity trading, assurance services, and so on. So I believe what is kind of specific to the region is those capabilities, which can put China not just as a SAF production center, but as well as a regional hub for financing, trading, and commercializing SAF internationally.
Thank you, Arnaud. And Patrick, I'd like to come back to you. Building on that, how can Chinese SAF producers best position themselves to assess the global voluntary demand? And what opportunities do you see for China to become the key supplier within the international SAF market?
So we're already seeing Chinese producers recognizing this opportunity. And as I say again, this voluntary opportunity is in parallel to local mandates. So those two aspects of SAF demand growth are both very important and they run in parallel. What the global market enables for Chinese producers is it gives them this much broader opportunity to monetize the environmental benefits of their product. So a Chinese producer that's looking to go after this market will, as I've mentioned, be working on their certification standards. They will be thinking about how they can bring the physical product to a local airport effectively and blend that because SAF still needs to be blended with jet fuel. How they can blend that and have that uplifted at a local airport. And then they will be thinking about how they sell globally. And as my company has seen in the market over the last few years, it's very difficult for airlines and producers to talk directly and reach agreements directly. In the case of some big airline groups, they can do this because they have the expertise and they have the long-term thinking. But in general, producers need to have long-term offtake agreements. They want to see a demand over perhaps 5 years, perhaps even longer, perhaps 10 years, so that they can make their business cases. Whereas airlines typically buy their SAF or indeed buy their ordinary fuel over much shorter periods, maybe 1 year, 2 years, 3 years maximum. So there is a mismatch in timing. It's difficult, therefore, for a SAF producer to go directly to an airline and reach an agreement. Hence the benefit of intermediaries in the ecosystem. That's the kind of thing, for example, that Future Energy Global does. We sit in the middle between producers and airlines. We sign offtake agreements, long-term offtake agreements with producers, and then we go and market and sell those environmental attributes, those emission savings to airlines and to corporates. So whichever way the producers go to market, they have to recognize the nature of the global market and the difficulty of going directly to airlines and perhaps the benefits of working via intermediaries. And as I mentioned already, doing this using the book and claim system allows them very easily to move their product, to move the valuable product overseas and globally without having to worry about moving the physical product so much.
Thank you, Patrick. And Ethan, is there anything you would like to add regarding the policy environment to support the SAF growth?
Yeah, I think I just agree with what Patrick is talking about. If you look at the SAF markets, we can simply divide it into the mandates as well as the voluntary. Well, yeah, I think I got some of the questions from audience already that keep asking about the status on the China mandates or how it's going to be balanced. Yeah, I would say, yeah, this is I would rather say that if we rely on the government's kind of signals like the mandate, I think the Chinese governments are behaving quite differently from the Europe because they're very seriously, if we really want to meet a target, definitely we want to just ensure that we can get it done. So apart from the mandates, I would say the voluntary markets is exactly one of the things we can work together, to help the airlines to get more access to the SAF, as well as especially together with the book and claim kind of mechanism, we can just greatly reduce the unnecessary logistics costs, for the airlines to get the environmental attributes. But the more importantly, we can also bring some of the corporate customers who have the ESG, requirements or the responsibilities to reduce their business trip, as well as to work on the green kind of supply chain. That definitely is a perfect match. I fully agree with what Patrick opinion on that. And I just want to add on something is that, if you really want to work on really well on the voluntary markets, I think this is a key for us to build up a trust foundation on that. In that perspective, the sustainability certification scheme is one of the key to solve that. You need to ensure that, the carbon reduction versus the jet fuel is genuine, is accurately calculated, as well as, even for the feedstock, you need to have the traceability system to ensure that the ecosystem is well managed with a custodian system. And with that, we sub-center in China, actually, we are leading, the building of that FCS, maybe probably in short, we call it a CSCS. So fundamentally, the logic is fully comply with the IQ CORSIA standard, while we are also trying, to make it much more fitful for the kind of a local resources and feedstock to, open more kind of cheaper resources or just bring down the whole cost. Well, together with the book and claim, this is definitely one of the key actions we can take in for this moment.
Thank you. As the global SAF market continues to evolve, the focus actually shifts from production to building confidence across the market. So certification, transparency, effective market mechanisms, and trusted international partnerships all have an important role to play in enabling the long-term growth for the SAF. So I'd like to explore each of those elements in a little bit more detail. And let's start with one of the key building blocks of the trust, sustainability certification. So even international buyers are increasingly expecting SAF to be supported by robust sustainability assurance and internationally recognized certification. So how is China approaching sustainability certification? And what are the steps being taken to ensure Chinese produced SAF can be recognized and trusted within the global aviation market?
Yeah, this is a very super good question. So first of all, let's say why we call it the SAF. Definitely, it's the sustainable aviation fuel, which means that we need, to replace the kind of a traditional fossil fuel with much more renewable and in a sustainable way. In that perspective, the feedstock definitely we're in China, we believe that we cannot compete with the land, with the water resources, with the food that the human beings we need to work on. So this is a very important for the feedstock. And let's say with the prevailing pathways at this moment, definitely is the HEFA technology. We rely heavily on the used cooking oil, and yet definitely with a huge population in China, we are one of the most important used cooking oil generators. So, but you need to have a very robust system to guarantee that this is a kind of a genuine used cooking oil rather than other, fraud or cheating resources. And with that, what we are with China SAF Center, what we are building on the CSCS, we, spend quite a lot or invest quite heavily on the kind of a traceability system. We are working with the cutting edge technology. We're building, with the GPS and also the traceability to ensure that every drop of the used cooking oil is generated from the restaurant. Then it goes to the feedstock procurement to the manufacturer, and then goes to the virtually the only one interplane service provider is called the China National Aviation Fuel as the CNAF, and then it goes to the airports, to the airlines. So all in all, the system is to ensure that this is a fully robust and well controlled kind of an ecosystem to ensure that the proof of the sustainability is genuine. This is the other thing we're working on. And also, as just again, as I mentioned, the book and claim with the CSCS, we're also building. I will just mention about it in details later. We're also developing kind of the very first platform in China together with CNAF. This is called the Anchor Trace. This is perfectly, to help the airlines to try to purchase to target the ESG corporate customers who are willing to pay for the green premium. We just call it a scope 3 kind of a reduction, while they can share with the cost of the airlines using SAF. So this is what we are doing on the CSCS system, and also we're building on the platform. And we do need, the wider recognition, especially I think from the panelists and also from the audience today. We need more kind of a uniform and mutual recognition with the different, systems and recognitions, trying to make it more easier and efficient for all the stakeholders, especially the customers, to get the cheaper and more access to the SAF globally.
Thank you, Ethan. Certification is clearly a critical part of building trust. However, certification alone does not create the market, as we know. Buyers also need confidence that the environmental claims are credible, transparent, and verifiable throughout the supply chain. So, Patrick, I'd like to invite you to join the conversation again. So, could you explain how the book and claim connects producers and buyers, and why it has become an important mechanism for scaling SAF internationally?
Yes, of course, Raji. So with book and claim, and this is a system that is already used in other renewable energy markets, so it's very well established. As I mentioned, it is separating the energy from the environmental attributes of that energy. So, for example, it's used in some renewable electricity markets where everybody shares the same electricity grid, but a renewable electricity supplier feeding power into that grid can monetize the emission savings by selling renewable electricity certificates separately from the power that they are producing. The very important part of book and claim, whether it's for electricity or whether it's for SAF, is that there is very strong and robust accounting to make sure that the emission savings are accurately tracked, that they are counted only once, that they can be traded and they can be retired, but that all of this is transparent so that the market has to be very, very robust and any sustainability claims have to be defensible. And Ethan made that point a few moments ago. So what we see with book and claim is that it's almost like the producer now has access to it. It would be like a small, for example, a craftsman making things and only being able to sell them in their local area, and suddenly they have access to the internet, to eBay, and they can now sell them globally. So in some ways, book and claim is allowing producers to sell globally because they don't have to move the physical molecules very far, and that's a big advantage. And I'd go back to one other aspect of book and claim, and something that Ethan, you mentioned a few moments ago about how corporates want to buy Scope 3 certificates from SAF to compensate for their emissions. Quite often, when we speak to global corporates who want to buy Scope 3s, of course, they think about how they can do this cost effectively, but many of them also say, well, last year, 40% of our travel was in North America and 30% was in Asia and 30% was in Europe, and therefore we want to buy Scope 3 credits in those same ratios. So we actually want to buy a certain amount of Scope 3 credits from SAF that was uplifted in Asia, for example. So they are actually looking for regional specificity, and that allows us, when we can find producers who are uplifting in particular regions, that allows us to offer specific products to our corporate customers. So I think there is a double opportunity for Chinese producers in that global voluntary market. One is that they can be very cost-effective producers and they can compete globally. And the second one is for those corporates, for example, who are looking for Scope 3 certificates from fuel uplifted in Asia or uplifted in China, then they can provide a specific product there as well. And that's what book and claim allows them to do.
Thank you, Patrick. And building market confidence depends not only on the effective market mechanism, but also on the confidence in integrity, transparency, and traceability of information that supports them. That's where the digital innovation becomes increasingly important. Arnaud, I would like to bring you back into the conversation. So increasingly, global buyers are looking for not only for SAF, but also for the confidence and integrity of associated environmental claims. So how can digital technology such as blockchain or digital registries and book and claim platforms strengthen the transparency, traceability, and also trust across the international SAF supply chains?
Thanks, Reggie, for the question. And coming myself from a tech background, so definitely this question resonates very strongly to me. Yeah, overall, digital technologies is the way we look at it will not solve all the problem, but it aims at accelerate, enhancing, and strengthening a business process rules to what we discussed earlier. So the way we see it at this impact is the digital infrastructure is becoming almost as important as the physical infrastructure to support the buyer needs and confidence, what you mentioned, where this SAF was sustainably produced, carbon intensity data, reliable, the environmental attributes that Patrick just talked a bit earlier, where the ownership, chain of ownership is coming from. So technology, we talked about, you just mentioned about blockchain, has definitely some attributes to support those, what we call tamper-resistant records, end-to-end traceability from the feedstock origin through the production and delivery. However, and I repeat again, blockchain and others are not magic. If you enter poor data, you will have a poor outcome as well. So it's still very important that the trust must be really grounded in certification, independent verification, monitoring, and governance. So that's one of the aspects. When we talk about book and claim and digital registries, for sure, those systems play a very critical role in recording the issuance, transfer, retirement of the SAF attribute. So as a buyer, it's absolutely a must to make sure that the systems are totally clear, auditable. However, one of the big issues if you talk about technology and beyond is interoperability, because we can see on the market between the major book and claim and registries and the other coming up, we do foresee one of the issues about interoperability between those systems. Those systems might have different rules, different way to handle the scope 3, different business rules, and that's one of the problems. On our side, the impact, because coming from the tech, we would like to leverage each and every, I would say, tools, whether it's about AI and so on, to enforce this, to streamline and to really enhance those transactions as much as it could to support the scalability of SAF.
Thank you, Arnaud. Building the trust is essential, but trust alone doesn't scale an industry. So for scaling this SAF, we need collaboration between different stakeholders. So I like to spend the next few minutes exploring what it will take to move from an opportunity to a large-scale deployment. And one of the biggest challenges in mobilizing the investment needed for the SAF plant is the finance. So, Arnaud, this question is again for you. From your experience, what gives investors the confidence to finance SAF projects, and how digital market mechanisms help to improve the bankability of new production facilities around the world?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And being a startup stage for financing is a very hot topic. So apply to the SAF, what we see very clearly is that investors, they don't finance SAF project simply because demand, because of green, they invest because they can see predictable cash flow, acceptable risk and return in the project. So we should absolutely don't neglect this aspect. So that's why it's very important if you want to attract capital to have a robust technico-economic business case of the project, securing your sustainable feedstock supply, of course. It was mentioned earlier, the offtake agreement is definitely a must because it can de-risk the investor on their potential return, and ticking the box of the regulatory and certification, which was as well talked earlier. I just wanted to mention, because we recently joined this organization called ICAO Finvest Hub, which is an ICAO, I would say, led initiative, so not an investment fund, but their objective is to help early stage concept into a project, and supporting company on their typical SAF project lifecycle. So we need this kind of initiative. We need to help new project developments. Most of them sometimes unfortunately fail. And crossing this chasm is very key if we want, again, SAF production to scale as it is to meet the net zero target for the industry.
Thank you, Arnaud. And international collaboration is essential to scale the SAF production. Ultimately, the long-term success also depends on being competitive in the global marketplace. So, Patrick, you have actually worked closely with the airlines, corporate buyers, and producers around the world. So, if you are advising a new SAF producer in China who is actually preparing to enter the international market, what would be your top priorities for building the long-term relationship with global airlines and corporate buyers? In other words, what distinguishes suppliers that are truly market ready for those that are simply producing SAF?
Another very good question, Reggie, and I'll answer that, and I'll also perhaps try and address a couple of the questions that have come in the Q&A at the same time. The producers that we see who are, I think, going to be very successful have clearly identified what their strong points are. They've identified that they perhaps have access to cost-effective feedstock. They have access to good power sources. Perhaps they have a good access to a local airport where and a blending facility where they can distribute their fuel. So they are conscious that they are coming into a competitive marketplace, and they are working hard to compete instead of just saying, "Oh, we'll do SAF and we'll do everything the same as everybody else," which doesn't allow them to be quite so competitive. Within the voluntary market, for example, airlines are, and there was a question in the chat about this. Yes, airlines are choosing to pay extra for SAF. There is a green premium, and the airlines are voluntarily increasing their costs as a result. However, there's a couple of things I would say about that. Because the airlines or other intermediaries are able to sell the Scope 3 credits from that SAF to corporates, it's possible to reduce that green premium very significantly, and in some cases that I know of, to actually reduce it to zero because of the ability to sell voluntary Scope 3 credits to corporates. And secondly, the airlines are doing this for let's call it ESG reasons, or for sustainability reasons, or for corporate responsibility reasons. And more and more, and this goes back to the question about how a producer can succeed, more and more we're seeing interest both from airlines and corporates, not only in the numbers, how much does this cost, but also in the narrative behind the particular SAF. So, for example, we recently did a transaction in the United States with Delta Airlines, where the SAF was produced using technical corn oil, which is a byproduct of corn. But the key point about that was providing additional income to farmers. So it was helping rural economic development in the areas where that feedstock was being produced. So more and more, both from corporates and from airlines, we're seeing interest in what the story is, what the additional benefits are of the SAF, not just the cost of the SAF. As we all know, the geopolitics of energy and of fuels globally is very, very turbulent at the moment. And as has been pointed out by many other commentators, at the moment, 0% of the SAF in the world is going through the Straits of Hormuz in the Middle East, because SAF can be produced globally. It can change let's say, the balance of which countries are energy producers and which countries are not. So there's a huge opportunity to change the shape of the world in terms of energy production, and I think that's a very important part of the SAF story. And therefore, a successful producer, for example, in China or elsewhere, I mentioned they will have to understand they're in a competitive market and so on, but they will also perhaps be thinking about how can they differentiate their product, or how can they tell the story around their product rather than just being a commodity. And the producers that we are talking to and that we are signing long-term offtakes with are the ones who are able to do that successfully.
Thank you, Patrick. As we come to the final part of our discussion, I'd like to finish by looking ahead. If we fast forward to 2035, what will define success, and what will distinguish the countries and organizations that have truly become leaders in global SAF market? And I like to hear from each of our panelists and invite them to share their perspective. Isn't looking ahead over the next decade, what gives you the highest confidence among China's role in future global SAF market? If we are having this conversation again in 2035, what achievements would you hope we could be talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. This is a very good and hyper. Just looking ahead, as I just mentioned at the very beginning, that with China is only the record for the green, transition, which is irreversible. And I think looking ahead in 2035, that's about 10 years time. We hope that China, we will become one of the leaders in the definitely in the SAF industry, not only in terms of the production side, but also taking the lead, the leadership in terms of the application and also the pathway improvement. Yeah, I saw quite a lot of questions from the audience. So first of all, the HEFI definitely is only to solve the 0 to 1 for this moment. But if you compare with the huge kind of jet fuel markets, SAF, just, the penetration is so kind of a nascent at this moment. So we do need more pathways and more access to the different feedstocks. That's in China. We not only have the used cooking oil, but we have abundant kind of municipal waste. We have the crops waste residues, which can be perfect for the gasification feature truck technology. And also with the foundation we already had in terms of renewable electricity, which is the key for the success for the eSAF. And together with the industrial waste gas, previous generated in China's kind of a industrial revolution. But in nowadays, we can perfectly combine those industrial gas waste together with the renewable electricity to contribute more to the kind of power to liquid, to the eSAF pathway. And ultimately, this is not only, contributes to a cleaner kind of a environments for Chinese people to live, because we do have a very strong, belief on our homeland. And ultimately, this is also to contribute to all the human beings for the only planets we have on Earth.
Thank you, Isan.
Yeah, this is yeah. Thank you.
Ultimately, global leadership is not determined by the production capacity alone. It is also shaped by how effectively producers are responding to the evolving customer expectations and changing market dynamics. So, Patrick, I'd like to turn to you now. So, looking ahead over the next decade, how do you see the relationship between the voluntary market, compliance framework, and digital platforms such as book and claim evolving? And more broadly, what gives you the confidence that these mechanisms will help to accelerate the global SAF deployment at the scale aviation industry requires?
Okay, that's a big question. Unfortunately, we don't have another hour to answer all of that. I think that the market is still very young, but I think it is going in a positive direction. And we see more and more interest from airlines and from corporates in the voluntary market. And I believe that the voluntary market will continue to develop alongside the mandated market. One reason for that is that corporates are central to the growth of SAF, and big corporates who are doing a lot of business travel, are doing a lot of air cargo transport. They want to reduce their emissions. They want to compensate for their emissions. And by using Scope 3 SAF credits, they can do so within their value chain. So, for example, a lot of corporates were waiting for guidance from SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, about how they can compensate for their emissions. And just in the last few weeks, SBTI released guidance saying that book and claim is an acceptable way to do that. So I think we will see more and more demand from corporates And indeed, there are some big corporates out there, whether that's Google, whether that's Microsoft, which is one of our customers, who are very ambitious in their targets, and they're talking about achieving net zero very, very relatively soon in the next few years. And there are some other corporates who are saying, oh, we can't get to 100%. We can't get to net zero very quickly, so there's no point in trying. And our message to those corporates is always, well, it's important to start as soon as possible, even if you start in a small way. Last year, SAF represented less than 1% of global jet fuel. So even if a corporate is compensating for 1% or 2% of its air travel with SAF credits, it's already ahead of the curve. So we see a great deal of potential for this market to develop over the coming few years. So I'm very positive about that.
Thank you, Patrick. As SAF market continues to mature, technology is also likely to play an increasingly central role in enabling the future. So, Arnaud, looking at the future, will competitive advantage come primarily from the production capacity, or will it increasingly depend on trusted digital ecosystem, transparent carbon accounting, and ability to connect the producers with buyers across the international market? And if you had to choose one of these, which one do you see as emerging key differentiator over the next decade?
Wow, you're giving me the most difficult question. It's so hard to choose, actually. And I have so much to say to echo what Patrick and Ethan said. But to me, I definitely believe that the corporate Scope 3 demand will become one of the strongest catalysts for scaling global SAF, of course, enabled by book and claim. And because the theme here is really about Chinese producers, we need education, we need to advocate that it's a additional revenue stream for them, which can help them to improve bankability and attract investors if needed. So that's really one of the key messages for producer overall, I would say. Patrick said rightly that SAF is moving from pure sustainability to energy security. So we could expect in the future different drivers and dynamic when it's about investing and scaling SAF. Because again, from less than 1% to potentially 65%, as Ayata suggested, we need to have 200 times more SAF produced in the next 25 years. So yeah, we couldn't wait.
Thank you, Arnaud. Before we move on to the final takeaway, I'd like to ask all three of you one question. If you have to identify a single biggest priority, which will enable China to become globally trusted SAF supplier over the next decade, what would it be?
In how many minutes?
1 minute for each of you. Just choose one factor which will help China to become a globally trusted SAF supplier.
Maybe I can continue. So it's really not on technical fuel certification, but mostly focusing on the international sustainability eligibilities, those CORSIA, Refuel EU, and other mandate compliance for export.
Thank you, Arnaud. And I think we have 1 more minute, so we can try to answer one question from the audience.
I just want, see a lot of question. I think Patrick and I just mentioned quite a lot on the voluntary markets, but we don't say that mandates is something we can't forget. I think the two markets need to work in parallel. Definitely, mandates just create a very firm and demand for the market, which is important for the projects to be going on. And then in Asia Pacific, we do need a more uniform rather than a fragmentary, kind of policy at this moment. I just want to address the concerns to the audience first.
Thank you.
That's a really good point that Ethan makes. And I just add one quick element to that. Why we talk also about the voluntary market. Within the mandated market, airlines are buying this fuel because their governments are telling them that they have to. In the voluntary market, it's possible to sell because those are voluntary purchases, it's possible to sell the Scope 3 credits from that fuel to corporates because that's additional demand. So the corporates are helping to drive additional demand and additional SAF production. Within the mandated market, it doesn't make so much sense to talk about Scope 3 credits for corporates because it's not increasing the amount of SAF, because the mandate is defining how much SAF there is. So the business model for the voluntary market is different to the to the mandated market. But the last thing to say very quickly is that even in some mandated markets, such as the European market, there is now a study going on about whether book and claim could be applied within that market to make it more efficient, because as Easton, as you said, it's all one planet, so it actually doesn't matter where in the world the SAF is actually used. It has the same effects on reducing emissions, and therefore it doesn't make sense to spend time and energy moving ships full of fuel from one place to another when there's no reason to do so.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick, Eason, as well as Arnaud, for your valuable insights and sharing your experience with the audience.